Welcome back to TechNet Radio. In today's episode, SharePoint Product Manager Bill Baer interviews SharePoint Certified Masters Ali Mazari and Spencer Harbour about user profiles and user profile applications in SharePoint 2010. Listen in as they discuss what user profiles are, their importance, how to manage them, and how to configure profile synchronization. Bill, the mic is yours.
Hello and welcome back to TechNet Radio. This is Bill Baer. I'm a product manager here in the SharePoint Product Group in Redmond, Washington. And today we are on episode 6 of SharePoint 2010 for the IT Pro, in addition to those who are familiar with our developer audience. So today we're going to talk about user profiles and the user profile service application in SharePoint 2010, one of our favorite topics to discuss. And joining me today are both Ali and Spence. Both are MCMs for SharePoint 2007 and SharePoint 2010. I'll let them do a brief introduction, and then we'll get started.
Sure. My name is Ali Mazari. I'm part of Microsoft Services and also Microsoft SharePoint Master for SharePoint 2007 and 2010. Also working with Spence and the rest of the team on the MCM program.
Hi folks, my name's Spencer Harbour. I'm based in Edinburgh, Scotland. I'm an independent consultant working with both Microsoft and their customers on large-scale SharePoint deployments. Like Ali, I'm an MCM for 2007 and 2010, and also one of the instructor team for the 2010 SharePoint MCM.
Great, thanks guys. So before we get started, I think it's important that we at least address what user profiles are, what the user profile service application is, and why it's so important to SharePoint. Can you kind of elaborate on those topics?
Absolutely. The user profiles really are the foundation for a multitude of features within the SharePoint product itself, and they allow us to do all number of interesting scenarios. Some of those include things like people search, being able to search for people based on their expertise or their declared interests, as an example. We can also target content towards users based on their profile. It also allows us to browse the organization hierarchy in a rich web-based control. Also underpins the My Sites capability, which allows each user to have their own private SharePoint workspace, but also expose their interests alongside social feedback elements such as ratings, tags, and notes, and so on. And it also helps integrate to a certain degree with the Outlook social connector. So the user profiles themselves are quite a core piece of any enterprise deployment. They underpin, as I said, most of these features. And the user profile service application, or UPA for short, is our management ability to define which profiles are going to be used, the privacy of those properties, and also many other management tasks around both the synchronization of that data with external sources, but also the My Sites capability. So one of those elements is the user profile synchronization capability. And this is effectively the process of getting the data or user attributes from other systems into SharePoint. So for example, Active Directory or a line of business application like SAP, where those pieces of data or attributes are more commonly stored within the enterprise. We can also write back data from the user profile in SharePoint in the new version, using the capability that's kind of bundled with the product based on Forefront Identity Manager.
So it sounds like from an architectural perspective, the user profile service has a couple of touch points, at least within SharePoint. Can you kind of just give me a brief overview of what the architecture looks like?
Sure. So we have fundamentally the first thing to talk about is the user profile service application. As I mentioned earlier, that gives us the ability to manage and operate this whole feature set area. And for that to work, we require a user profile service instance running on a machine in the farm, and this is a .NET assembly that allows us to surface these user profile properties within all of the features that we just spoke about. And then we have an additional service instance, which is called the User Profile Synchronization Service. And this is effectively a SharePoint wrapper for the Forefront Identity Manager pieces. And those are a couple of Windows services which are responsible for both managing that operation, but also actually performing the synchronization with external data sources. There's also 3 different databases in play here. The profile database is the point of storage for the profiles themselves, and also the activity feeds, the social data for users. Then we have a social database where tags and ratings and notes and so on are stored. And then there's the synchronization DB, which is used by the User Profile Sync service for managing its operations.
So it sounds like, from that perspective, there's a number of different elements to the User Profile Service application. We have NP services, we have databases, of course, we have some components within SharePoint, and beyond that, we also have Active Directory or whatever our directory source may be. So it sounds like we have a number of considerations when it comes to permissions. Can you kind of talk about the permissions that we need to successfully set this up and get it running?
Sure. There's certainly many more moving parts in this realm than we've had previously, and I think permissions is probably the number one cause of pain while setting this up. Dependent on our source directory system, we must have certain privileges to be able to synchronize the data. But first, we need to provision or set up the User Profile Services itself, or the User Profile Synchronization Service. And this requires a number of permissions on the machine in the farm which we wish to deploy it to. And those, for the provisioning itself, will require that we use the SharePoint farm account, or what's also known quite commonly as the database connection account. This is the account that's entered when we run the SharePoint configuration wizard to create the farm or join the farm initially. And so that account is the account that will run those 2 Forefront Identity Manager Windows services. That account, in order to provision the services, will need to be a local machine administrator of the machine that we are running the UPS service instance on. So that's a hard requirement. Now, once the service is set up successfully, we can remove that privilege. So we only need it for the period of time whilst we are starting the service. Once it's up and running, the account simply needs the ability to log on locally to that machine. So that's really the only permission necessary there for the farm account, specifically for User Profile Synchronization. And then once we have the service up and running, we of course intend to use this to synchronize data with an external directory system. And so we require some rights on that external directory system. And generally what we would recommend is that we would use a dedicated account for performing the synchronization, which is different to the farm account. And we need to provide what's known as replicating directory changes to this account. And replicating directory changes, despite its name, actually doesn't make any changes to the Active Directory at all. It's simply a mechanism by which we can retrieve a change log from AD, which enables the synchronization process to be much more efficient. So we need to grant that privilege to the account we're using for synchronization, what we term the synchronization connection account. And we need to set that right at the domain level, so for the domain itself, the root object, and all its descendants. And that will allow the User Profile Synchronization Connection account to retrieve the change log and do a synchronization. It's quite important to note that we need that right, even if we are just wanting to import data from Active Directory. So even if we don't wish to change the data, we still need that permission. If we do want to change data on Active Directory, we will need to grant, of course, the synchronization connection account additional privileges so that it has the ability to write to a certain container or organizational unit within the directory service. And for AD, those permissions are create child objects and write all all properties. So there are, these two kind of key accounts that we're interested in, and those permissions need to be set correctly, preferably up front before we perform synchronization.
Okay, so one of the key terms that I heard you key up on a couple of times as you overviewed the permissions is really the synchronization service. So let's move beyond permissions now, and let's talk about some of the other setup tips that you may have for people, because one area that's going to make people very excited or very happy is if we can help them get past the synchronization service is stuck and starting. That's probably been one of the most common issues that people have come across when they're configuring UPA for the first time. So if there's other setup tips that you may have that can help people set up UPA successfully and run it successfully, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, generally speaking, as I mentioned sort of up front, the number one issue is the permissions themselves, and that's certainly from my perspective what's caused most problems. So, for example, if the farm account isn't a local machine administrator, they will see this common sort of pattern where the service gets stuck in starting. What's actually happening there is that when we attempt to start it, there will be 15 attempts made to provision the service, and so that's why it appears as if it's stuck, when in fact it's actually trying multiple times to get up and running. So I would generally recommend that everybody deploys the latest cumulative update for SharePoint Server. So that's currently the August cumulative update. That's the first tip I would give here. That will greatly improve the setup experience, and there's a number of changes in those updates which address some of the more common problems. Another one to watch out for is if the domain name of the server doesn't match the NetBIOS name, and I'll give an example here to hopefully try and explain this better. So if we have a domain called corp.sharepoint.com, the NetBIOS name of that domain will be corp, and so those two don't match, and therefore we need to set an additional permission in the configuration partition of Active Directory. And we also need to set a property of the service application before we start the service from services on server. And that's a very common sort of cause of the stuck-in starting. Another issue is related to Windows PowerShell. If we provision the service application using Windows PowerShell, we need to go in and change the default schema for the farm account on the sync database. And if we don't do that, again, we will get stuck in starting until we resolve that issue. And I think the last one, which is becoming more common, is related to central administration. If we run central administration over secure sockets layer, which is a strong recommendation because we actually enter credentials into central administration quite often, we will need to alter the connection information for the user profile synchronization service as well.
Great. Those are some great tips, and I think it covers a lot of those areas where people have had challenges, at least in the past, provisioning UPA. So, Ali, you've been pretty quiet, so I'm going to pick on you now.
Sure.
Let's talk about user profile service, ADFS, and claims.
Well, I think that's a huge topic with, talking about the user profile service application on my side. One of the great things that we see that happening with the customers that, everybody's talking about claims and, they're kind of moving to that direction. While, we can look at the claims authentication authorization in terms of accessing things like, team sites or, portals, etc., most enterprises, they're, deploying my site as well. And one of the questions is that, okay, if I want to configure claims in my farm, what's going to happen to my site, and, how should we configure that? A rule of thumb is that, if you're configuring claims for your enterprise portal or, team sites, and you want to give them access to their My Site, definitely you want to make sure that the web application that is hosting the My Site is also configured using the same trusted identity provider. The reason for that is that if they log into the portal and they use their ADFS, for example, claim to get authenticated and authorized, and then they click on their My Site, you want to make sure that it's going to be like a consistent access to all this related sites and My Site personal sites. And one issue that we see happening is that you're going to configure your sync, and everything's going to happen successfully. So you kind of bypass all the issues that Spence just mentioned earlier. But when you click on your user profile, you get an error which says that hey, user not found. The reason for that is that when you go into the trusted identity provider settings, you want to make sure that when you configure your user profile sync, you're going to make that connection. So I think there is a gotcha that usually people kind of forget to do the configuration when they're configuring the sync, is that they have to select the trusted identity provider and their sync connection, and also kind of provide the information on the mapping on the set that, okay, I'm going to use, for example, email as my claim identifier. So we have to kind of set that in the sync connection so that when we do the profile import, we have that all the information in the user profile database. So that when I log in using my ADFS claims and I click on my user profile, then the logic is there to basically check for the user profile based on a claims identity. That's something that most people tend to forget, and it's good to kind of talk about it, to pay attention to those kind of stuff when you configure My Site and user profile in an environment that the trusted identity provider such as ADFS is already configured.
Yeah, that sounds great. Now, moving on, it sounds like we're all set up at this point. Spence has given us some great information on how to get it configured and how to get it running. You've given us some information about claims and ADFS. So the next step, of course, is a disaster strikes. I don't want to have to set this up again. What are my best options for high availability and disaster recovery?
Sure. I think that's another great question. So let's first talk about high availability. Basically, like any other service application, you can run, multiple instances of user profile on, different servers. So what happens is that, if you have two application servers that are running the user profile service application, then the service application infrastructure and, the built-in load balancer can take care of, providing, responses to the request. So that, if one of your user profile service instances goes down, the other can take over. One thing that usually, makes people kind of wonder and, make them confused is that, okay, what about profile sync? So you can only configure sync with one instance of user profile. So that means if you are running a user profile instance on application server 1, you can configure sync on that machine with that user profile service application only. You can have, multiple sync, but not on the same sync connection. So that's not going to work. So you have to kind of be aware of that. The other thing is, let's say, you have two application servers that they are running, user profile service application, and you already started the sync. And by mistake, you run the sync on the second server. The question is that what's going to happen? So the logic basically stops the first attempt and try to, recover the sync process by itself. On the disaster recovery, basically, I think that the options that you have, one is to basically look into the administration toolkit that we just released. So that's something that, you can leverage to kind of sync the user profile between, different farms, your production and DR farms. The other way is to just, use mirroring. One thing that is important is that, you want to make sure that you have managed meta service application databases and also the user profile and social covered your mirroring or lock shipping process, because you need to have those three databases when you do the DR. Otherwise, pretty much you're going to lose all your social activities in the DR farm that, has been covered by the users.
No, that's great. So one of the other key topics I think that we should point to is not everybody is going to be doing a net new deployment of SharePoint 2010. And I know from SharePoint 2003 experience, we had a profile database. In 2007, we moved towards a more isolated SSP model. And now we're as you just discussed, now we're in a service application model with a number of different components related to the database side. So one of the big things that we need to approach, I suppose, is upgrade. How do we handle upgrade from 2007 and get into a state in 2010 to where we have an operational user profile service application that really replicates what we did in 2007?
Sure, and a great question. So I think there's a myth out there that, whenever we talk to other folks or, our customers and say, okay, so what is the plan for upgrading your SSD? The question is, we cannot upgrade SSD to 2010. Well, not everything, but certainly you can do the user profile upgrade. It's a great news because, in lots of organizations we have, lots of customization and some, custom attributes and data entered by users that you want to kind of keep them when you do the upgrade and post-upgrade to 2010. And we have command lists, which basically helps you to do the DB attach and connect your 2007 SSD to your 2010, and basically provision as a new service application, which is the new user profile service application. There are some other steps that you need to kind of follow and kind of plan for it. One of them, for example, is that if you have lots of custom images for the users, the structure is kind of different in 2010. But the good news is that we have the related command list that you have to run post DB attaching the SSD and having the service application provision things like the command list that basically help you to update the profile, the photo store. I think it's called Update SP Profile Photo Store, if I'm not mistaken, Spence. The other thing that is kind of important is that, there's a dependency between the user profile service application and management of the service. So you want to make sure that you have those services running and, they have proper rights. And after you do the DB attach and you basically upgrade it to 2010, you want to import all those keywords and, settings to the managed metadata service, which I think there's another command which basically helps you do that migration. I think it's called move as profile managed metadata. And, definitely something that is kind of related is that, it's just not upgrading the SSD. You have to think about your MySite as well. So it's going to be a combination of migration from MySite content and your SSD, and also, following all the steps.
Okay, let's talk about documentation at this point. So we've walked through setup, we've kind of walked through administration, we've walked through some different scenarios, we walked through the ADFS scenario, we walked through the claim scenario, we understand the architecture, we can do some high availability and disaster recovery, and we also understand kind of the upgrade approach and what it takes to get from 2007's model to 2010's model. So the last thing really is, what additional resources do we have on the web to kind of help us out with user profiles service applications?
Well, I'll let Spence talk about it because he has some great materials that I think everybody should kind of go and at least take a look at it before they plan or, deploy. Spence?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the single best resource is actually up on TechNet, funnily enough, within our SharePoint Server 2010 operations section. And the title of the article is Configure Profile Synchronization. This is quite a long document, but it's going to walk you through all of the prerequisites and also provide a planning worksheet for those prerequisites. These are the things I mentioned around the rights required for certain accounts and so forth. And then there's also detailed procedures for both the configuration of the user profile synchronization service itself, but also for the Active Directory administrator. So it's very common that the SharePoint administrators within an organization won't actually have the rights or even be able to log on to the machines that are hosting Active Directory in that company. So those procedures are detailed in this article, which allow you to give those procedures to the AD admins so that they can go ahead and configure those prerequisite permissions. So just again, that article is titled Configure Profile Synchronization SharePoint Server 2010, and that's up on TechNet. I also have a couple of articles that are hosted on my blog, one which is a walkthrough of the configuration and setup, and also the exporting of profile properties back to Active Directory. And that can be found on my blog at harbar.net. And then there's a follow-up article which details some of the common issues with starting the service instance and some of those tips that I mentioned before are in more detail over there.
Great. So we've kind of covered the whole scope of the user profile service application today. You guys have both given us some great resources to kind of follow and understand on how to get it provisioned and how to keep it running. And based on that information, I'm sure you guys have a lot of other things that you'd like to share. Do you both have a blog or a Twitter handle that we can follow? I know Spence mentioned his blog earlier, but I'm sure we've got some other resources that we can follow both of you on.
Sure. I also have a technical blog at blogsmsdn.com/ALIMAZ, and we both also actually use Twitter. So my hashtag is ALIMAZAHERI, which is basically my first and last name. And I'll let Spence to talk about his Twitter account.
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is HarbRS, which is HARBARS, and I'll use that to point out other interesting resources and so on that I come across. And also another useful resource in general for SharePoint 2010 for IT pros, but specifically on user profile synchronization would be Todd Carter. Todd is a Premier Field Engineer, and his blog can be found at www.todd-carter.com. So that's another good place to go for information on this area.
All right, great. I'd like to thank you both for joining us today on TechNet Radio, and this has been an interesting discussion, and I think it's going to help a lot of people out in the future. So thanks once again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.